Questions without notice. The member for Macquarie.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Which bill currently before the Parliament deals with the urgent issue of wage theft at restaurants?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the member for her question, and I can tell her that right now, the Attorney-General is drafting laws to deal with criminalising worker exploitation. And on top of that, Mr Speaker, there are bills in the Parliament right now that deals with the wage theft that is occurring in the union movement through workers' entitlement funds. And I'll tell you what this scam deal of the unions does. What it does.
The member for Gorton.
You don't like this answer,
The Leader
do you?
of the House. The member for Gorton. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The members on both sides. The Minister for Health. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It was a very specific question. It went to an issue which is of great concern in the community, the rip-off of people who are working in restaurants. The Prime Minister should address that question. He might refer to Mr Columbaris's restaurants and the millions of dollars. There's a few issues. The MasterChef, people know about it. Well, how about you answer a question?
Leader of the House, so the Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. I'm not going to call the Prime Minister straight away. I think I'll be dealing with this issue reasonably frequently. And yes, it was a tight question, but the policy topic the Prime Minister is dealing with is wage theft, and I can detain the House very early. I'm listening to the Prime Minister, provided he's on the policy topic. I believe he's being directly relevant, and I'm going to hear the Prime Minister, and he can continue.
Mr Speaker, that the Leader of the Opposition with a capital O might like to understand this, that the bill that is in the Parliament at the moment deals with workers' entitlements, right? Funds paid into workers' entitlements funds held by unions, which ensures that when they are in a position to have their entitlements paid out, i.e. their wages, which doesn't matter whether you're working in a restaurant or anywhere else, that the dividends from those funds isn't paid off to other unions, which is the practice of those unions. Now, the Labor Party might not want to recognise that what they are doing in supporting that practice is thieving workers' wages, Mr Speaker. That's what the Labor Party is doing by supporting practices of unions, which is thieving workers' entitlements from those funds. Now, on the matter that the Leader of the Opposition also raised in relation to the Columbaris matter, Mr Speaker, now, on that matter, Mr Speaker, that matter was exposed by the Fair Work Ombudsman as a result of the $10 million of extra funds we put into that organisation to ensure that that matter could be exposed, and that an enforceable undertaking then was secured through the action to protect those workers. Now, on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, we know whose side we're on. It's on Australian workers' side. The Labor Party, Mr Speaker, who knows whose side they're on? They weren't on the side of tax cuts for Australians. They weren't on the side of farmers dealing with drought. And today we understand they are only on the side of militant unions.
The member for Chisholm.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please update the House on how the government is on the side of Australian workers to help them and their families get ahead?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Chisholm for her question, and can I commend the member for Chisholm, the first Chinese-born Australian woman to be elected to this parliament, who gave her maiden speech here yesterday in what was an historic moment for this parliament, which I'm sure all members would agree. And I want to commend the member for her excellent speech yesterday, particularly in speaking Mandarin to the Australian Chinese community, and to particularly mark that moment. But in that speech yesterday, Mr Speaker, she said this, that she was elected on the mandate that if you have a go, you get a go. And, Mr Speaker, no one exemplifies that better than the member for Chisholm. And the member for Chisholm knows that she was elected on the basis of ensuring that Australian workers get a go. And I'll tell you how they're getting a go. More jobs, Mr Speaker. The highest level of employment participation of the working age population in this nation's
Member for
history.
McMahon.
On top of that, Mr Speaker, tax relief for all Australians.
Member for
who are
McMahon
working
will
hard.
cease interjecting.
Tax relief that the Leader of the Opposition and the Labor Party have sought to oppose in this place. At the election they opposed it, seeking only to put more taxes and higher taxes on Australians' workers, saying to them that they shouldn't keep more of what they earn. I've already in my previous answer referred to the actions we're taking to ensure stronger penalties for those who engage in wage theft. They've increased tenfold under the legislation our government has put in place. The increased resources we've put into the Fair Work Ombudsman, the criminalisation of worker exploitation, which laws will come forward from the Attorney-General shortly and the Minister for Industrial Relations on. But it does beg the question. Australians know whose side we're on when it comes to Australian workers and their entitlements and their jobs and their earnings. They know where we stand, but where does the Labor Party stand? Firstly, we've got the Labor Party in this place opposing laws which will ensure unions cannot siphon off the earnings of workers' entitlement funds and just spread them willy-nilly to their other union mates, Mr Speaker. And that's like having a union super fund paying the earnings of your superannuation to another union, Mr Speaker. Now that's against the law, and this should be against the law also, Mr Speaker. And we also know that they oppose laws that will boot out serially offending union officials from breaking the law, just like company directors were. Now, the Leader of the Opposition says he wants to get rid of John Sector from the union movement. Now, we're only trying to help you here. There's a law here you can vote for to ensure that John Sector gets booted from the union movement, and the Leader of the Opposition turns his back on those laws and he turns his back on hard-working Australians.
The member for Wills has the call. I don't need the member for Lyons to help. I just don't need to keep repeating that. I know who the member for Wills is. The member for Wills has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations. On how many occasions this year has a worker contacted the Fair Work Ombudsman to report an incident of wage theft, only for the Ombudsman to make no contact with their employer?
The Minister for Industrial Relations.
Well, I mean, it would be unusual if I would have that level of detail to hand. I can certainly get that for the member. I am aware of several occasions where the Ombudsman has taken complaints about underpayment which originally went to a union without action and went to the Ombudsman for action. I am aware that in the last budget that this government provided $10.8 million to the Fair Work Ombudsman to investigate precisely the types of things that we're now talking about. I am aware that our government has a zero tolerance for this sort of behaviour, whether that is underpayment or wage theft. The difficulty is, Mr Speaker, that they seem over there to have a very low tolerance for underpayment, but they've got a monstrously high tolerance when it's workers' money being diverted from workers to unions. That's when their tolerance levels seem to get out of whack. And what we have is $10.8 million given by this government to the Fair Work Ombudsman to investigate these matters. They are now investigated more heavily than they have ever been investigated previously. That builds on $30 million in unpaid wages, representing more than 13,000 workers, with completed audits of 4,500 Australian workplaces. That is more than when Labor were last in office. When Labor were last in office, Mr Speaker, and this might interest the member for Wills, but when Labor were last in office, notwithstanding their indignation today, they cut the funding of the Fair Work Ombudsman by 17%. So the body that investigates underpayment, when they were in government, they cut its funding by 17%. And you know what, Mr Speaker? You know what they also cut? You know what they also cut, member for Wills? The Fair Work Ombudsman staff, who are paid money to investigate underpayment of wages, they were cut by members opposite by 20%.
So the indignation exists now, but when the rubber was on the road and they were required to investigate these matters, they underfunded and cut the staff of the organisation who were meant to investigate these matters. So we'd be very happy for another question like that, Member for Wills. Another Dixer.
The member for Lindsay.
My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how hard-working families and small businesses in my electorate of Lindsay will benefit from the Morrison government's legislated tax relief? Is the Treasurer aware of any higher taxing alternatives?
The Treasurer has the call.
Speaker, thank the member for Lindsay for her question, and I can inform the House that she brings to this place experience in running her own small business and working in the not-for-profit sector. But more importantly than that, she's committed to the values that underpin the Coalition's policies. Respect for the individual and the power of their enterprise, Mr Speaker. Reward for effort and encouraging aspiration.
Member for Chifley.
Mr Speaker, a term that mystified the member for Sydney, Mr Speaker. And the member for Lindsay understands that as a result of the tax cuts that passed this parliament just a couple of weeks
member
ago,
for Chifley.
76,909 taxpayers will get a tax cut in the member for Lindsay's electorate, Mr Speaker, and more than 34,000 of those will get the full $1,080, Mr Speaker. Now, over 13,000 small businesses will also be able to access the extended instant asset write-off, which has been extended to $30,000, and for companies with a turnover of up to $50 million. And I can inform the House that as of today, the ATO has confirmed that more than 3 million Australians have put in their tax return for the 18-19 year, and over $3.6 billion of refunds have been provided to Australians. Money that can be spent at Thor's Cafe in Penrith or Bubbles Florist, Mr Speaker, in Wellington County. Money that can be spent creating jobs across the economy. And it's our tax cuts. It's our tax cuts where we've changed the rate. So for those who earn between $45,000 and $200,000, the rate is being reduced from 32.5 cents down to 30 cents. And we've changed the thresholds, Mr Speaker. For the 19-cent rate, we've changed the threshold from where it is today at $37,000 to $45,000. And we're abolishing a whole tax bracket, Mr Speaker, the 37 cents in the dollar tax bracket. Now, I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches? Well, we saw the alternative approach at the recent election, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition
and those opposite supported $387 billion of higher taxes. And just this morning, the member for Rankin was at a press conference, and he was asked, does he still support the retirees tax and the housing tax and the superannuation tax and the income tax, Mr Speaker? And he didn't say no, Mr Speaker. It's the 19th time since the election he's refused to say that they've walked away from their $387 billion of higher taxes. So only the Coalition can be trusted to cut taxes for all Australians.
Just before I call the member for Kingsford Smith, I've asked the member for Chifley to cease interjecting a number of times. I'm just warning him that his word ration is over for the day, and I'll call the member for Kingsford Smith.
My question is to the Attorney-General and Leader of the House. What bills are before the House that implement the recommendations of the Banking Royal Commission?
Member for McEwen interjected. Actually, not a bad point. I didn't hear the start of the question. The microphone wasn't on, I don't think. Could you just begin the question again? Is that okay?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Leader of the House. What bills are before the House that implement the recommendations of the Banking Royal Commission?
The Leader of the House.
Unusual for the Leader of the House to take a point of order on a question to him as Leader of the House, but that clearly is a question that needs to be directed to a minister, and the minister responsible for those bills.
Members on my left, The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah. Thanks, Mr Speaker. The role of Leader of the House is meant to be a real job. And as part of that members of Parliament are able to ask about the legislation.
Manager of Opposition Business can pause. The member for Latrobe can cease interjecting. Let me make very clear with these points of order we need to go directly to the point of order. I'm not at all interested in the commentary, okay, and I'm giving fair warning. So just go straight to the point of order.
It has always been in order to ask the Leader of the House about the business of the House, regardless of what portfolio that business falls into otherwise.
Member for McMahon. So you're testing not just my patience, I can tell you. I'll make 2 points because, whilst it's unorthodox, certainly the Manager of Opposition Business well knows that I've seen many examples where that has occurred. But also, I mean, the practice also makes very clear, if I can point out to ministers, that they are entitled to, if it relates to another portfolio, they're entitled to refer that to a relevant minister if they wish to. That's a right they have. So I'll leave it in the hands of the Leader of the House whether he wishes to answer it or refer it to a relevant minister.
Happy to leave it in the hands of the Treasurer.
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I can confirm to the House that actually this parliament has passed legislation implementing the Royal Commission's recommendations, including Recommendation 3.6 to prohibit super funds from inducing employers, including passing legislation for Recommendation 3.7, which is introducing civil penalties for trustees and directors of super funds. We've also passed regulations which extend AFCA's remit in terms of dealing with financial complaints back to the 1st of January 2008. We've also legislated product intervention powers.
The Treasurer has the call. The Manager of Opposition Business has the call on a point of order.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Speaker. The question simply asks what bills are before the House. It doesn't ask for the history of previous parliaments. That was why the question was originally directed where it was, but the only question is what bills are before the House.
Yeah, and I think that's a reasonable point, but I don't at all think what the Treasurer has set up to this point is unreasonable in terms of giving some context, and he's on the policy topic, but he does need to bring himself to that aspect of the question or wind his answer up.
76 recommendations. We're taking action on all 76, including currently we have exposure draft legislation to end grandfathered commissions for financial advisers, and after that consultation it will make its way to the parliament, and we would expect that those opposite would support our legislation. But the point remains that after the Royal Commission was handed to us, we took 4 days to respond. Those opposite took 22 days. We've already legislated significant number of recommendations from the Hayne Royal Commission. Others are in the pipeline, Mr Speaker. Others are in the pipeline, and we're taking great care to do this properly, to get this right, so that the Australian consumers get a better deal.
The Leader of the Opposition. The Leader of the Opposition. The member for Warringah.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Warringah has some of the most congested roads in Australia, and it is a huge detriment to people's daily lives. A proposed solution, the Beaches Link Tunnel, would improve congestion by bypassing the Spit Bridge, which creates a bottleneck between the northern beaches and the lower North Shore. The proposed Beaches Link Tunnel has been talked about for over 2 decades, including by the former member of Warringah, and is now in the New South Wales planning and assessment process. During the campaign, the federal government committed $50 million from the Urban Congestion Fund to improve access to the tunnel from Bargalla. Could the minister please tell the House what has happened to that $50 million commitment?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the
Well, Mr Speaker, we stand by all our commitments that we make, and that's the difference between this side and that side, is that when we promise something, we actually deliver. And when it comes to delivering, we're delivering $100 billion in infrastructure over the next 10 years. So that's a decade-long pipeline of investment, of infrastructure, and certainly when it comes to busting through congestion, and I will get the Minister for Urban Infrastructure to add to my remarks, but we added $3 billion in the last budget to our busting through that congestion, particularly for capital cities, making sure that people can get home sooner and safer. Because if you live in the cities, if you work in the cities, indeed if you visit the cities, the one thing that you don't want to be spending too much time is looking at the brake lights in front of you. And I look forward to working with the member for Warringah to making sure that we develop infrastructure in her electorate, as we do for all electorates. It doesn't matter what political persuasion those people are. We want to make sure that we've got the infrastructure that meets the needs of Australians, whether they live in urban areas, indeed whether they live in regional areas. And I'll ask the Minister for Urban Infrastructure to add to those comments.
Give the call to the Minister for Urban Infrastructure.
Well, I thank the member for her question, and as the Deputy Prime Minister said, we are committed to every single one of the commitments that we made at the election, including the one that you referred to. And in fact, we're in negotiations as we speak with the New South Wales government over every single project, just as we are with every single other project around the country. Now, in New South Wales, we have provided almost $33 billion of infrastructure to that state since we have come to office, and that included, just in the last budget, an additional $7.3 billion. And now the member would know that one of those major projects, which is coming to fruition now, is the North Connects projects, which members of her electorate will be beneficiaries of, as well as members of the member for Bennelong's electorate and other members in the northern suburbs of Sydney, and member for Browra and elsewhere. But there's also a number of other urban congestion busting projects which will be rolling out over the months and years ahead. I mean, that includes $50 million for the King George's Road upgrade in the member for Banks electorate. That includes another $4.5 million for the Blaxland Road, Balaclava Road intersection improvements, $4 million for the Princess Highway and Waratah Street intersection upgrade, $95 million for the Horsley Drive upgrade, which I know that the shadow member over there, the member for McMahon, is interested in, $50 million for the Homebush Bay Drive, and I could go almost all afternoon listing the projects which we are doing to bust
the Minister's time has expired. The
easier.
Minister will resume his seat. The member for COWPER.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how the cost of building major infrastructure, such as roads, bridges and tunnels, is being impacted by militant union behaviour?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for COWPER for his question and congratulate him on his excellent inaugural speech a little earlier on today. Mr Speaker, I know how vitally important infrastructure is to him and to the people living in his electorate, particularly the Coffs Harbour bypass. Now, the Liberals and Nationals are getting on with the job of building that $1 billion plus piece of infrastructure with tunnels. Mr Speaker. You won't find a stronger advocate for this than the member for COWPER. He fought hard for it. He is going to deliver it, Mr Speaker. But what is so frustrating and annoying is unlawful union militancy, which is driving up the cost of infrastructure right across the country, right across this nation. And the member for COWPER knows all too well the cost of what unlawful behaviour does on society. He has seen it firsthand as a frontline police officer, as a detective, indeed as a police prosecutor on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. The Master Builders Association has estimated that infrastructure projects in Australia including schools, hospitals, roads. They cost up to 30% more due to union militancy and unlawful industrial action. Mr Speaker, it's not just the master builders that has highlighted this issue. The Business Council of Australia in 2012 and Infrastructure Australia the following year suggested that infrastructure is 40% more expensive in Australia than in the United States of America. And the McKell Institute in 2016 suggested that a two-lane undivided road costs 78% more in Australia than in the European Union, 53% more than in Canada, 42% more than the US and 26% more than in the United Kingdom. And what do the unions think about this? Well, Mr Speaker, sadly, unfortunately, unbelievably, they're quite proud of that. They think that they are above the law. The CFMMEU alone has been slapped with more than $16 million on more than 2,000 contraventions of industrial laws in recent years. Big fines, terrible union. Mr Speaker, in 2017 the ACTU Secretary Sally McManus said in regards to industrial law, "I don't think there's a problem with breaking it." That's what she said. Well, there is a problem with breaking the law. And then we have the Greens leader, Senator Di Natale, on Sunday said that his party had a strong and proud tradition of civil disobedience. I'm the only member of the Greens, he said, that actually hasn't been arrested yet. That's what he told insiders. So I would remind the member for Melbourne that we're supposed to make, not break, the law in this place. We are supposed to make the law, not break the law. The Liberals and Nationals government is proud of our delivery on infrastructure. We're spending $100 billion on infrastructure over the next decade, and what we don't want to see is cost overruns caused by militant unions, caused by recklessness, caused by people breaking the law. Whether they're the Greens, whether they're the unions, we make the laws, we shouldn't be breaking the law.
Concluded. The member for Eden-Monaro.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Why did the minister say in question time yesterday that he has, and I quote, no association with Jamland Proprietary Limited, when ASIC documents show he has an interest in the company?
The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, the point of order is Standing Order 100B. That question has been asked and fully answered. Now, what happens—
No, members on my left.
Mr Speaker, what happens—
you don't need to sort of plough on the Leader of the House. I'm going to make a point that I make regularly, and it shocks me that I'm obviously not being clear enough, but if members want me to hear the point of order to rule on it, it's very important that they don't yell uncontrollably and then demand I rule on the point of order. So it's your question time, and I can tell you what, there's a time limit to it, essentially, and I'm not in a rush. All right? The Leader of the House.
Thank you for that time, Mr Speaker. So yesterday the member for Griffiths asked a question. It was a bit messy. It was a compound question. It had two parts. The first part was that the first part sought confirmation that the minister had an interest in a company. The second part sought confirmation that there had been or was some departmental investigation. The minister answered the second part first. He said he had no association, clearly meaning with the departmental investigation, and then he noted that he remained at arm's length from the company that was the subject of the question. There has never been any dispute that the minister has a relationship with the company, and that is on the member's listed interests.
I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
He'll end up in the clink if he's defending him.
Mr Speaker, first of all, the question that's being asked is asking him effectively to reconcile statements yesterday with ASIC documents. That question is being asked for the first time. In terms of what his answer was yesterday, the sentence that appears in Hansard is, and I quote, "I have no association and have remained at arm's length at all times from the company Jamland." So given that that was a statement, and I'm sorry,
members,
the words in the investigation have been added in the point of order that was just taken by the Leader of the House. They were not part of the quote that this question asks, and I'm quoting directly from the Hansard.
Look, members on my left, I'm actually trying to listen to your manager of opposition business. There's two issues here. It's whether a question's been fully answered. It's not really for the chair to judge that, except unless it's an identical question. And I take the point that the Leader of the House is making, which it's a very similar question, but certainly the rules and indeed the practice are that the question has to be identical, absolutely identical. In other words, yesterday's question, for that to be the case. And then, if that were the case, yesterday's answer would have been deemed fully answered because the question's been answered, but it's not. So that question is in order and it's able to be asked because it's different, but it's referring to yesterday's answer. So I'll call the minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Now, my indirect interest in Jamland has been widely reported in the media and was declared in accordance with the rules. I have no association with the compliance action, and I have never made a representation in relation to it. Never made a representation in relation to it. This has been confirmed at Senate estimates by the Secretary of my department in April this year. Now, Mr Speaker, I make no apology for seeking and receiving a briefing on policies that seriously impact the farmers in my electorate. It's what the people of Hume expect of me as their local member. In fact, Mr Speaker, the people of Eden Monaro should be asking why their representative didn't do the same. Around half of the affected grasslands are in his electorate.
Member for Eden Monaro.
Mr Speaker. Now, I stand up for the farmers in my electorate.
The minister will pause. The member for Eden Monaro will stop interjecting uncontrollably, or he won't get to hear the answer to the question that he's asked. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I was saying, I stand up for the farmers in my electorate, unlike the member for Eden Monaro. But those opposite want to tear agriculture down. They oppose the drought fund this week in this place. They oppose the drought fund. They took policies to the last election that amounted to handing over the control of agricultural land to bureaucrats.
The minister will resume his seat. The Deputy Prime Minister will cease interjecting. The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The question was very specific and on direct relevance. I raised that he's straying away from the question.
Yes, I'm very aware of that. And look, the Minister for Health, please, I'd rather just deal with those making the points of order. Okay, if it helps him, I don't actually hear what he's saying. I just hear noise. That's all I hear. Okay. The Leader of the House has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thought your earlier ruling was very clear that when a specific question is asked and answered as it was, that does not mean that the minister cannot then use the remaining time to put context around that answer. Otherwise, this degenerates into a pop quiz, which it has never been in the history of this parliament. That is a very fair answer of context when a specific answer to a specific question was given.
I thank both the Deputy Manager of Opposition Business and the Leader of the House. I allowed the question. The question wasn't identical to yesterday. And without being endlessly repetitive, I'm just telling the House I can refer to a number of precedents if that helps the Deputy Manager of Opposition Business. It might take up a bit of question time, though. I allowed the question. The minister has addressed the topic. He's still on the policy topic. And can I just say concisely, what you can't do is ask a question and then essentially do the equivalent of have an answer you want him to read out. You can't do that. And the rule for direct relevance came in 2010, and the Deputy Manager of Opposition Business has been around all of that time, and he's well aware of how that's operated with respect to the policy topic. Minister's in order. If he wishes to continue his answer, that's his business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And as I was saying, those opposite want to tear agriculture down. They opposed the drought fund this week. They took policies to the election that amounted to handing over control of agricultural land to bureaucrats, Mr Speaker, to bureaucrats, and they took policies to the last election that would hike the price of electricity to farmers alongside gas and diesel. Now, Mr Speaker, I will always stand by the farmers of my electorate. It's about time those opposite did the same.
The member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations. Will the minister please explain whether the government is concerned at reports of repeated and consistent breaches of workplace relations laws by militant unions, and what is the government doing to address these matters?
The Minister for Industrial Relations and the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Of course we are concerned about that, and there is a very important bill before this House today which would allow for a court to make a finding that a person was not a fit and proper person to be a public official for a union or indeed for an employer association. It applies to both those instances. And, for instance, the court may make that finding because the person in question had a significant history of breaking Australian civil law or because they had a history of breaking serious criminal laws punishable by 2 years or more imprisonment. And ultimately it must benefit employees, workers, all Australians who pay for infrastructure, that the court has the discretion to disqualify a serious lawbreaker from holding a position of public office in a union. And it's become obvious this week that the members opposite don't like being asked whose side they are on. So instead, why don't we ask who is on Labor's side? Is John Setka, the Victorian branch secretary of the CFMEU, on Labor's side?
Clearly.
Now, he was on the Labor team for a very, very long time. Then the opposition leader said he was off the side, but now it looks like he's back on the side and is going to be there for quite some period of time. The Leader of the Opposition said he would be gone by July 5.
When was that?
He then said, the Leader of the Opposition, it was an open and shut case. Clearly he's been getting more legal advice from the Shadow Attorney-General. Although you're batting better than your usual average because you got the open part of the open and shut case right. Just the shut part of the shut case was a little bit of a problem. Indeed, on radio it was put to the Leader of the Opposition, well, you're putting yourself on the line. If he isn't thrown out, it makes you look pretty silly as leader. July 5, remember, was the deadline. Leader of the Opposition, well, that's right. And it is right because he's still there. But why would it be? Why would it be the case? Why would it be the case, Mr Speaker, that we would have one rule about what is a fit and proper person for the Labor Party, but completely a different rule for what is a fit and proper person to hold public office in a union? Indeed, why would you oppose a bill that sought to put a test in place so that a court could actually determine what is a fit and proper person to hold public office? Could it be? That's a good question. What is there to fear for the Labor Party in this? And perhaps it was identified from the very man, John Setka himself, when he said he'd stop the CFMEU giving money to the Labor Party, which, quote, as he said, would be a big threat to a lot of people. Well, one response, Leader of the Opposition, is you could get rid of that problem entirely by declining to take money from the CFMEU. And then there would be nothing to worry about and nothing to fear, and you could flow through and see this person gotten rid of. But surely there must be a reasonable test to see people such as this no longer holding public office in the union.
The Minister's time has concluded. The Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy. In his last answer, the minister said that his interest in Jamland had been declared in accordance with the rules. Given the last published register makes no reference to the company, does the minister stand by the claim he just made to the parliament, or was that claim misleading?
The Minister for Energy has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I said in my last answer, my indirect interest in Jamland through my family company has been widely reported in the media and was declared in accordance with the rules, and was declared as in accordance with the rules through my family company. Now, as I have also said in the previous question, I have no association with the compliance action that has been the subject of these questions. I've never made a representation in relation to it. But I tell you what I've made representations about: the farmers in my electorate. The farmers in my electorate, because I care about them and I stand up for them.
The minister's concluded his answer. The member for Menzies.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I asked the Minister for Industrial Relations if he'd advise the House whether there are concerns regarding the operation and regulation of worker entitlement funds set up and conducted by militant unions.
The Minister for Industrial Relations and Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for his question because, of course, that is also a matter of concern, as it would be to any rational—
The Minister will just pause for a second. He doesn't need to go back to his seat. The member for COWPER has been warned twice. She'll leave under 94A. The Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the second very important bill before this House today is a bill that deals with workers' benefits funds, workers' entitlement funds. It is meant to put a proper regulatory system around those workers' entitlement funds. Those funds are designed to keep safe and secure workers' money that may be needed in the future for things and events such as long service leave, sick leave, or, very importantly, severance and redundancy payments. Now, Mr Speaker, there are 9 large workers' entitlement funds in operation, and unfortunately at present they are the subject of very little proper regulation in terms of governance or in terms of transparency. And the result of that absence of governance and transparency has not been in the best interests of workers and has involved the misappropriation of their wages. In the financial statements, for instance, Mr Speaker, of the Electrical Trades Union of Victoria, they make note of one of the largest funds, which is known as Protect. Protect is a fund meant to hold the money of workers specifically to pay for future severance entitlement of workers. In the Electrical Trade Union of Victoria's financial year's accounts ending 31 December of 2017, under other items there is a heading that says significant changes in financial affairs, and it lists a transfer of capital from Protect to the Electrical Trades Union. And then on page 2 of that report it lists the amount of that capital transfer as $32 million. $32 million of workers' money put aside to pay for severance benefits sent to the Electrical Trades Union, and that report describes the reason for this as the fact that the ETU is a sponsor organisation of Protect. $32 million, that is some sponsorship deal. Cristiano Ronaldo was the biggest sponsorship deal in soccer history, and that was $31 million. $32 million worth of workers' money sent to the ETU. The written financial expenditure policies would stop that from happening in this bill. What on earth could that money be for? And what is most fascinating about this racket, and that is exactly what it is when you look at the same ETU document, it notes that some proportion of that $32 million has been set back as a loan facility, listen to this, to loan back capital distributed to the ATU if Protect needs to recall the distribution to meet ongoing expenses. So if there were an event where Protect needed to pay severance payments but didn't have enough money because it gave $32 million to the ETU, they could always ask for a loan. Why would you not support legislation to make that no longer able to happen?
Concluded. The member for Newcastle.
Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Treasurer. In the Senate this week, the Finance Minister ruled out changing the timetable for legislative increases to the superannuation guarantee to 12%. Will you, the Treasurer, now do the same?
The Treasurer has the call.
Yes.
The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on the steps the government has taken to protect Australian workers from dangerous non-citizens including outlaw criminal gang members and any association they have with militant unionism.
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Listen up.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his very important question. And there's a silence that's gone across the other side because some of them might know people within the CFMEU. Some of them might even have received money from their CFMEU mates for their campaigns. Any chance of that? No. So, Mr Speaker, the government's taken a decision, in fact, under the Prime Minister's former role as Immigration Minister in December of 2014, to tighten the rules in relation to the way in which we can cancel on character grounds the visas of criminals in our country. And we have, Mr Speaker, been able to cancel 4,500 visas of people who are here as non-citizens who have committed crimes against Australians. Now, I want to update the House, Mr Speaker, because importantly, listen to this figure, we have now cancelled the visas of 229 outlaw motorcycle gang members. And that is great for our country because these people are involved in some very bad activities. They are the biggest distributors of ice and amphetamines and unlawful substances otherwise in our country, and they have very definite links. You wouldn't guess who to? The CFMEU. The CFMEU. Now, the problem, of course, is with cancelling the visas of those bikies, it now appears that there is a shortage of hired muscle to go onto the building sites for the CFMEU. This is a great dilemma. Could you imagine they get the call at the bikie clubhouse? They're in the middle of an import that's come in. They're cutting the drugs up. This afternoon they've got a shift where they're going out to the local milk bar to extort money from mum and dad, the operator, and they get a call from John Setka. Could you go around to the local building site, break the arm of a couple of carpenters? They're not paying their extortion money to the local CFMEU rep. The CFMEU must be paying big money. Must be paying big money to the bikies for this relationship to continue, given that the bikies are making significant money, huge margins in the distribution of ice, and yet they still continue their association with John Setka and the CFMEU. I'll tell you what, Mr Speaker, do you know who else is continuing his association with John Setka and his many fellow travellers in the union movement? This Leader of the Opposition. What we know about this Leader of the Opposition, that is in favour of something, he's against it. He's for something, he's against it. He is no better than the person that used to fill the seat that he now occupies. We know that, having watched the Labor Party for many years, we know that the Labor Party's been happy to take $16 million from the CFMEU. The CFMEU gave $1 million to the left-wing Get Up organisation, and let me tell you, the Labor Party is led by a weak leader, as weak at least as his predecessor.
The time has concluded. I call the member for Lyons.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Deputy Prime Minister, when will work begin on the new Bridgewater Bridge?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the member for his question, Mr Speaker. The Bridgewater Bridge is something that we have said we would fund, and we will, Mr Speaker. It's quite as simple as that, Mr Speaker. We're getting on with the job. We're working with the Tasmanian government, the Hodgman government. When I go to Tasmania, Mr Speaker, the difference between what we saw before the Hodgman government taking over the reins in Tasmania and what we see now is writ large, Mr Speaker. Fact is, there is infrastructure such as the Bridgewater Bridge, which we look forward to building with the Tasmanian government. There are projects such as the Scottsdale irrigation scheme, which we're getting on and building. And during the election campaign, it was delightful to go to the—
The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On relevance, it was about when.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. I just say to the Deputy Prime Minister— No, I'm just going to address this issue before I call the Deputy Prime Minister. It was a very specific question, but I think I heard an interjection, you know, what day? I mean, you can't demand these sort of— Yeah, well, it was a specific question, the Deputy Prime Minister obviously needs to address the question, but he's entitled to talk about in the context he's doing. But he obviously doesn't need to feel compelled to use the entire 3 minutes if he doesn't want to. No, the Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
It's interesting, Mr Speaker, to get questions about infrastructure from those opposite, because when they were in power, Mr Speaker, between 2007 and 2013, the only thing they built were their egos, Mr Speaker. But we are going to get on. We are going to get on. We're going to build the Bridgewater Bridge, Mr Speaker. The fact is, Mr Speaker, there are issues that the Infrastructure Australia has identified with that particular project, Mr Speaker. There are some unresolved engineering issues. There are some cost factors. When we get those issues resolved, and we will, because we are a government that does things, we are a government which builds things, Mr Speaker, we will get on with that project, just like we will get on with other projects right throughout Tasmania, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, we're building roads
the Deputy
right
Prime
through
Minister
Tasmania.
will pause. Members on my left, including the member for Ballarat, keep interjecting on the minister. He's actually just, if they'd listened instead of interjecting, he's actually answered the question.
They're just rude, Mr Speaker.
Don't try and help. Please don't try and help. But the Deputy Prime Minister has, after giving some context, just actually answered what the issues are. Now, if you want to keep persisting with it, who kicked the third goal in the 1971 grand final? I mean, that's fine, but he's actually just, I believe, been very relevant and given the answer that he can at this point. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, so whether it's the Bridgewater Bridge, which we will build in conjunction with the Hodgman Liberal government, whether it's the Bass Highway, whether it's the fourth irrigation project, whether it's the Scottsdale irrigation scheme, we're getting on and we're building a better Tasmania, just like we're building our future right across this nation for the member's electorate, for the member for Grainler's electorate. No matter which electorate it is, we're building our future, we're building a better Australia, and we're getting on and doing it.
The member for Bonner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the minister please advise the House about the value of building and construction industry to the Australian economy? What measures has the government taken to protect this vital industry from militant unionism?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank
Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bonner for his question. He understands how important building and construction is to Queensland, and all of the members on this side of the House understand how important the building and construction industry is to the Australian economy. Last year alone, building and construction was worth about $141 billion, so about 7.5% of GDP. And well over 1 million people were employed in the building and construction sector. Now, the Coalition has always backed building and construction and the hard-working people in building and construction, and that's why we set up an industry watchdog. We established the Australian Building and Construction Commission in 2005. And it's important, Mr Speaker, to just do a little bit of a recap on why it was so necessary for us to establish the Australian Building and Construction Commission. So the Coal Royal Commission uncovered some staggering examples of union thuggery within the industry. This included fraud, corruption, collusion and anti-competitive behaviour, unlawful work practices, violence and inappropriate industrial practice. Now, the ABCC changed all of that. So while it was in place, productivity grew by 9%. The Australian people were better off by about $7.5 billion.
Minister will just pause for a second.
Annually.
The member for Macarthur will cease interjecting. I've asked him on a number of occasions. His next interjection will be his last for question time. I can promise him. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Now, to the eternal shame of the Gillard Labor government, they abolished the ABCC. And what happened? It was a return to the bad old days on the building and construction sites. Now, Mr Speaker, the Coalition had to fight tooth and nail to re-establish the industry watchdog, the ABCC. But Labor still didn't learn, because they took to the election last May that they would abolish the ABCC again. Now, this is an appalling state of affairs for Australians and for the building and construction industry. But, Mr Speaker, the final word really needs to go to the people who actually work in the building and construction industry, the hard-working, quiet Australians. Their judgment on the unions is absolutely crystal clear. 25 years ago, 34% of the construction workforce was a member of a union, and by 2016 that had dropped to 10%. Mr Speaker, that says it all. If Labor was truly for the workers, they'd stop running the union agenda and they'd help us crack down on union officials who do the wrong thing. Unfortunately, the only thing Labor is interested in building is a power base for their union mates.
The Minister's time has concluded. The member for Corangamite.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Why won't work on the South Geelong to Warn Ponds rail upgrade be commenced before July 2024? Good question.
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And, Mr Speaker, all infrastructure has to be over a phased period. You cannot build it all at once. When you're spending a record $100 billion on infrastructure, you can't spend it all in the 1 year. But, Mr Speaker, we're getting on with building a better Corangamite. And when you look at the investment that we're making in the member who asked the questions electorate, Mr Speaker, the Warrnambool rail line upgrade, over $100 million, the duplication of the Princess Highway. And I appreciate the fact that the Leader of the Opposition and I have been as one when it comes to road safety and issues on the Princess Highway. I see him nodding. I appreciate the fact that we are one on that. From Warn Ponds to Winchelsea, over $82 million, Mr Speaker. The Great Oceans Roads upgrade, $25 million. So significant because there are many people who want to go and see the 12 Apostles, want to see the beauty that is in that area. And the fact is we're getting on by spending $25 million Pararapip upgrade of Forest Road and Greys Road, $1 million. Now that mightn't seem like a lot of money to the member for Watson, but every bit of infrastructure spending gets people home sooner and safer. Whether it's rail, whether it's road, whether it's $1 million, whether it's $100 million, we're getting on with building our future, building the people of Australia's future. Mr Speaker, Bridges Renewal Program in the Corangamite electorate, $4.3 million. Black spot funding of $6.8 million. And for councils within the member who asked the questions electorate, they got a 25% increase in roads to recovery funding. That wouldn't have happened under those opposite, Mr Speaker. Would not have happened, but it's happening under us. And let me tell you, the mayors right throughout Australia are delighted. We've got the Mayor of North Burnett in the gallery, Mr Speaker. She came to see me this morning and expressed gratitude about the roads funding, and we'll work with her to build even more infrastructure and better roads in the North Burnett Regional Council, Mr Speaker. Black spot funding for Corangamite, $6.8 million. Building Better Regions Fund, $15.4 million. Now, when there was regional funding under Labor, that went to electorates such as the member for Watson, who's so chirpy and always calling out. And let me tell you, the member for Watson does not NOT represent a regional electorate. But under Labor, it was considered regional.
I'll just say to the Deputy Prime Minister, I think it was fine when he was confining himself to the Corangamite electorate, but a sort of wider character assessment was not part of the question.
Well, I'll finish the list by just saying not to mention $2 billion for the Geelong to Melbourne Faster Rail project, which we'll get on to do. Billion.
The member for Bass is seeking the call. The member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Employment, Skills, Small and Family Business. Will the minister please update the House on what the government is doing to help protect small and family businesses from the actions of militant unions?
The Minister for Employment, Skills, Small and Family Business has the call.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Wakefield.
Member for Bass for her question.
Member for Wakefield will leave under 94A.
She's a very keen supporter of small business, and particular when it comes to
just the minister can pause.
Very big.
I'm not going to debate issues on 94A with any member, particularly the member for Wakefield. If he doesn't know by now, if he interjects, member for Wakefield will resume his seat. I've made this very clear. This is about the dignity of the House. The member for Wakefield knows by now if he interjects, and I ask him to cease interjecting, if he interjects immediately, I'm going to ask him to remove himself from the House. And I'm not going to have him backchat the chair when I'm representing the House. I'm now naming the member for Wakefield. Naming the member for Wakefield.
I move that the member be suspended for the remainder of today's proceedings. From service of the House, I move that the member be removed from service of the House. I move that the member be suspended from the service of the House.
The question is that the member for Wakefield be suspended from the service of the House. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Good job. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, to assist the House, perhaps the Leader of the House could get advice about the motion that he moved, because it referred to a seat that does not exist, if he does it properly, just so we don't waste a lot of time on a procedure.
Well, that's my fault, so it's the member for Spence. Yeah, no. Yeah, well, it's the member for Spence, so we can stop ringing the bells for a second, and I'll just do it again. I name the member for Spence. The Leader of the House.
The Spence be removed from the proceedings. Be suspended from the House.
Members on my left.
Yes, well, it is a contingency that I wasn't quite planning for, I'd have to say. I move that the member for Spence be suspended from the service of the House.
The question is the member for Spence be removed from the service of the House. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. Order. The question is the member for Spence be suspended from the service of the House for 24 hours. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Gray and Nichols tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Werriwa and Lawler tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 80, noes 66. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. Yeah, and the member for Spence is suspended from the service of the House for 24 hours. And the Minister in continuation.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And as I was saying, there are 10,341 small businesses in the electorate of Bass. Of these, the biggest industries are construction, agriculture, which the member for Bass knows extremely well, forestry and fishing. And when it comes to small business, the Morrison government wants to back small business. We're cutting taxes for small business. We're removing red tape for small business, and we're opening up new trade opportunities for small business. And the other thing we're also doing is we are protecting them from union militancy, despite Labor fighting us every step of the way. Look at our record. We established the Australian Building and Construction Commission, a tough cop on the beat to ensure the rule of the law applies on Australian building sites. This is in stark contrast to the Labor Party and their extensive history of backing the CFMEU and their law-breaking activity. Labor wants us to return to chaos by abolishing the ABCC. We set up the Registered Organisations Commission to ensure that employee and employer organisations do the right thing by their members. We passed the corruption benefits legislation, again opposed by Labor, which banned dodgy payments between registered organisation representatives and those who they were bargaining with. We abolished the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal, which saved 35,000 small businesses, 35,000 small businesses opposed from those opposite. And let's not forget, those small businesses employ 7 million hard-working Australians. We're on their time. We're on their side. But the question is, what is the position of the Leader of the Opposition? How does the Leader of the Opposition explain supporting the expulsion of Mr Setka from the Labor Party, but does not support legislation that would, if Mr Setka continued his unlawful behaviour, see him being expelled from his position as a union official? That is the question that this question time needs an answer to, and it would be very good if the Leader of the Opposition went outside and answered that question. That is the question you need to answer.
The member for Paterson.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Why is only 3% of the funding to extend the M1 to Raymond Terrace available in the next 4 years? 3%.
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, it's better than some of the funding that Labor gave to some of the electorates when it was in, Mr Speaker. And as I said in my previous answer, we are getting on over a phased process. That's the responsible way to roll out infrastructure. Not like, and the member for Paterson, I appreciate, is in a regional electorate. And when Labor were last in government, regional spend was $404 million. That was for the electorate of Paterson and other regional electorates. We've doubled and then we've tripled that spend in our past 2 terms, and we'll now spend 6 times that amount over the next 3 years. Over the next 3 years, our budget over dedicated regional funds is $2.7 billion, increasing our spend of $1.5 billion. And the member for Paterson should be absolutely delighted that we're getting on with spending $15 million on the Cessnock Road, Testers Hollow. Well, she should be very pleased. The M1 Pacific Motorway extension, $1.6 billion allocated to that, Mr Speaker. M1 productivity package.
Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, that road's in Queensland.
No, you need to state the point of order.
This is a question
the Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat.
Road.
As I said in the previous answer by the Deputy Prime Minister, he was fine when he was confining his remarks to the particular electorate. But once he strays beyond that, he's straying beyond the question itself.
Well, in the members for Paterson's electorate, Tenterfield and Newcastle, under the Roads of Strategic Importance, $140 million. The Roads of Strategic Importance, an initiative that was come up from this side of Parliament, not that side, because that side is not interested in those vital regional linkages, that vital regional connectivity, Mr Speaker. The Hunter Expressway, $1.4 billion, but they are all connected in to Paterson. They are all making sure that people from Paterson, who the member represents, are getting home sooner and safer. Cessnock Frame Drive Bridge replacement, $2 million. We're getting on with replacing those bridges to help productivity, to help freight supply lines, to help create jobs and build a better future. Mr Speaker, the Black Spot program, for the member who asked the question seat, $6.8 million. $6.8 for those Black Spot program, which is going to help avoid road crashes. And the Kennard Park upgrade for Wellington, $200,000, Mr Speaker. We are getting on with building a better Paterson. We're getting on with building a better future, getting on with building a better Australia.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Housing. Will the minister outline what the government is doing to support workers to achieve their aspirations to own a home? Is the minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Minister for Housing has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Boothby for her question. And I know the member for Boothby, as is the Prime Minister, as is every single person on this side of the House, committed to helping prospective first-home buyers get back into the market. And can I say the Morrison government has a range of initiatives to support first-home buyers who are trying to get onto the property ladder and trying to buy their first home. And it's been very encouraging to see that since the re-election of the Morrison government, confidence amongst first-home buyers, indeed confidence amongst all buyers, has improved. We've seen green shoots in most of our major markets. Prices have stabilised in most of our capital cities and big population centres. Clearance rates are now up to 70% from much lower position not long ago. And confidence on a range of indexes. Confidence is improving, with the most recent being the ANZ Property Council Index, with confidence rising by 13 points. This comes on top of 110,000 first-home buyers entering the market in 2018, the highest level since 2009, and it's no accident that that increase in first-home buyers in 2018 followed our housing budget in the 16-17 and 18-19 budgets. It is delivering for first-home buyers. One of those initiatives was the First Home Super Saver scheme, which is opposed by the Labor Party. The Labor Party went to the election saying they would abolish the First Home Super Saver scheme, which allows first-home buyers a tax cut by salary sacrificing into super. 3,500 Australians have been assisted in buying their first home with the First Home Super Saver scheme, yet the Labor Party want to abolish it. And of course, we're building on that outstanding work with the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme, which will start from the 1st of January next year and allow prospective first-home buyers to buy a house with a 5% deposit. Now, after the Prime Minister's outstanding speech announcing that policy, Senator Christina Keneally criticised that policy, and then 3 hours later the member for McMahon adopted it. So we're very, very pleased that the Labor Party were forced into supporting that policy, because it will allow even more first-home buyers. And I'm asked about other policies by the member for Boothby. The only policies that the Labor Party took to the election with respect to housing was their housing taxes, abolishing negative gearing, doubling capital gains tax, making it harder for first-home buyers, pushing up rents. Let's remember 30% of people rent, yet the Labor Party had a policy designed to push up rents. So it's the member for Boothby, it's the Prime Minister, it's members on this side of the House that are dedicated to ensuring we make it easier for first-home buyers to get into the property market, and we're already seeing results.
Sorry. The Member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Why will only 10% of the funding for safety upgrades to the Princess Highway south of Nowra be available in the next 4 years?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and really pleased that we're getting so many infrastructure questions today. And when in the last Parliament, the 45th Parliament, Mr Speaker, the now opposition leader, the member for Grainler, couldn't get a question, Mr Speaker, because the member for Maribyrnong wouldn't give him one. But we're getting question after question today, which shows the renewed focus on infrastructure and the renewed enthusiasm about our record spend, $100 billion of infrastructure that we're spending over the next 10 years. So there's a plan. There's got to have project management. There is a vision by this side and hopefully now endorsed by that side for infrastructure rollout over the next decade. But, Member for Gilmore, you can't do it all in the first year. You can't do it all in the second year. It's got to be phased. You've got to have a plan. You've got to have vision. Now, I know there's not much planning or vision over that side, and that's why you are over that side. But the member for Gilmore should be very, very pleased that we are getting on with building such projects in the Gilmore electorate as the Nowra Bridge. $155 million we've allocated, and when we say allocated, we will build it. We will build it. We will. Princess Highway Corridor, $500 million allocated. Eurobadalla Roads upgrade, $9 million, Mr Speaker. Shoalhaven River Bridge planning, $10 million. We'll do the planning and then we'll build the bridge. We'll make sure the feasibility study comes back, make sure the right planning is done. We'll get on and we'll build it. High-vis workers, making sure that we've got those excavators on the ground. Mr Speaker, the Gilmore safety package overall worth $5 million. Heavy vehicle freight corridor at South Nowra, $2.95 million. The Bridges Renewal Program, in the member who asked the question, $2.4 million. And the Black Spot Program, she'll be very pleased to know, the member will be very pleased to know that there's $20 million being spent in her electorate, Mr Speaker. But her electorate, who I have to say is also going to be the beneficiary of tax relief, Mr Speaker, thanks to the fact that the Liberals and the Nationals were returned to government on May 18.
The Deputy Prime Minister is now changing policy topic. So.
I am, but they're also
you won't.
They're also using the Princess Highway. 56,113 of them who will get
the Deputy
benefit from tax relief.
I'll just say to the Deputy Prime Minister, it might assist him in the House if he just saves that material for a different answer to a different question.
I may well do that for the next question, Mr Speaker. Thank you.
The member for Moreton.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. When will work start on removing the dangerous level
the member
crossing?
for Moreton, pause. Look, I'm being sort of interjected on. There was Bob's question. Look, can I just say to the government particularly, I mean, all I can do is, if the government don't jump, is call the person who jumps, or if two people jump, the standing orders make it very clear, 65C, I call the person who, in my opinion, jumped first. On this occasion, the member for Moreton had no competition. The member for Moreton— No. I'll say to the Prime Minister—
A3, going well.
No, I'm going to address this point because it is causing some confusion. I'm not party to any arrangements that occur. I'm only aware of existing arrangements, and that is with respect to the independence first question, which the then Leader of the House enshrined in Hansard after, I understand, speaking with all parties. If the government, the opposition and the independents want to change the arrangements, that's their business. I have to operate under the standing orders, and I can only call someone who's jumped. That's all I can do. I can't be randomly asking people to jump. So the member for Moreton has the call. No, you can't take a point of order, the member for Kennedy, because you did not jump, and the member for Moreton— All right, I say to the member for Kennedy, I'll hear his point of order.
Advised that I would not—
I haven't called you yet. I haven't called you. I will hear from the member for Kennedy what his point of order is.
Advised that I wasn't on today. That was the only reason I didn't jump. So there's obviously been a mistake made. I'm sorry.
Okay. I thank the member for Kennedy. The member for Moreton has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. When will work start on removing the dangerous level crossing on Boundary Street in Cooper's Plain in Moreton?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, the member will be pleased, and given the fact that you gave me leeway last time, that in Moreton 72,628 people in the electorate, the member who asked the question, are going to be getting tax relief. Tax relief, Mr Speaker. But
no,
well, you did say
I'll just say to the Deputy Prime Minister, I've made this point. I've made this point twice now, and no, I don't want it to be. I don't want to be at all confusing about this. On that question, when he talks about taxation, he's on a different topic, and it's entirely irrelevant. I have a lot of time deciding what's directly relevant, but that's one of the easiest ones I've had today.
I thought you gave me a bit of leeway, but that is fair enough, Mr Speaker. In 2010, Mr Speaker, Labor promised to fix Harung Road, but never did it, Mr Speaker. That's typical of Labor, because they often promised, never did it. Made a lot of promises, went to elections making a lot of commitments, never ever kept them, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the member for Moreton will be pleased to know, though, that $500 million is being spent on the M1 motorway, 8 Mile, Plains to Daisy Hill, Mr Speaker. Very pleased to know that the Ipswich motorway, Rockley to Darra, Mr Speaker, $200 million. We're spending... Are you going to make up your mind who wants to stand up?
No, I can actually... I don't need to hear a point of order. Look, I've said twice now to the Deputy Prime Minister, he needs to confine himself to the policy topic. If he's talking about infrastructure, I'm being very generous in allowing that policy topic to be confined to the electorate. It was a very specific question. I'm out of patience on it. He can either do what he did in the first couple of answers, where I defended his right to do it. If he's going to stray and ask for extra leeway, what he's asking for is for me to ignore the practice, and I'm not going to do that. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
And this is infrastructure in the member for Moreton's electorate, Mr Speaker. Interchange at Mains and Kessel Road, Mr Speaker, $210 million, Mr Speaker. These road upgrades are helping in the member for Moreton's electorate, Mr Speaker. We want to get people home sooner and safer, whether they are travellers who are getting home to their families.
The member for Moreton on a point of order.
Speaker, this is a dangerous level crossing in my electorate. Nothing to do with infrastructure already built or out on the edge of my electorate. This is in the middle of my electorate.
I just say to the member for Moreton to resume his seat. He should have listened to how I ruled on the earlier points of order, and the Deputy Prime Minister, provided he's confining himself to your electorate, I think that's in order. It's certainly what I've allowed today. The Deputy Prime Minister.
And that's why we're spending records amount of money on black spot funding, record amount of money on level crossings, record amount of money on bridge replacements, record amounts of money, Mr Speaker, on roads to recovery. Councils, more than 500 of them, right across the country, are getting an extra 25% for roads to recovery. And I'd be happy to come to the member for Moreton's electorate and look at the particular crossing to which he refers, Mr Speaker, because we are making sure, whether it's urban, whether it's regional, Mr Speaker, we're busting congestion, but particularly in urban areas, Mr Speaker, spending $4 billion on busting through congestion in urban areas. And I appreciate, Mr Speaker, that it is a 10-year build. It's a 10-year, $100 billion. Mr Speaker, the members opposite can cry out all they like, because when they were in government they didn't spend anywhere near the level to which we are spending on congestion busting, on infrastructure, whether it's road, whether it's rail, whether it's airports, whether it's seaports, Mr Speaker. We're getting on with building our future and building a better Australia.
The member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question goes to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on the importance of a strong and consistent approach to national security policy, and is the minister aware of any alternative approaches that may put the Australian community at risk?
The Minister for Home Affairs is the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. We all know that at the last election this government went to the people saying that we would work hard to make sure that we kept our borders secure, but to make sure that we kept our country safe. And, Mr Speaker, we have done that over a number of years, where we've been able to introduce now 17 tranches of national security legislation designed to keep Australians safe. And as I said yesterday, and I repeat it again today, no Australian should be complacent about the threat to us as a Western democracy. We've seen terrible, horrific attacks where people have lost their lives in all parts of the world, where extremists have undertaken actions, reprehensible actions that has resulted in a loss of life. And we have, Mr Speaker, been in a position where we now have had a debate, as people will be aware, around temporary exclusion orders, which allows the Minister of the Day to temporarily exclude for a period of up to 2 years an Australian citizen that is suspected of fighting for ISIL or being involved in a terrorism cause. We can manage their return back to our country in that arrangement. Now, we have sought the support of Labor over a period of time for this important bill, and the Labor Party has been in favour, they've been against, they've been in between. And the fact is, Mr Speaker, we have got a position where last night, when this bill was debated in the chamber, we had the Shadow Minister, the Shadow Attorney-General, the member for Isaacs, arguing that the bill was unconstitutional. He moved 41 amendments, and then in the end, when he realised that we had the votes in the Senate to pass this bill, what does he do? He folds and votes for the bill, a bill that he said was fundamentally flawed, unconstitutional and required 41 amendments. He didn't get up one amendment. The bill is not in an amended form. And how can people look to the Labor Party and have any idea what they stand for? Earlier this week we saw, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party in favour of tax cuts, against tax cuts, eventually vote for tax cuts only when they realise that we had the support of those in the other place. They've done the same on drought assistance. They are for it, they are against it, they're in between. Who knows where this Leader of the Opposition stands? Who knows what he stands for? But we do know this, Mr Speaker, he's not consistent when it comes to the most important issue, the most important test of any leader in this place, and that is whether they have a consistency of approach to national security. This Leader of the Opposition is at least as weak as any of his predecessors in this place in recent history, and he has demonstrated it in the last 24 hours. You cannot have a position, Mr Speaker, where you are for and against, in between, ultimately fold. People don't cop that. People don't cop that.
The Minister's time has
out.
concluded. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
All right.